Hello, what's up, Lakers fans? I'm Shane Jackson. This is a Lakers Theory podcast, a solo edition of the Lakers Theory podcast. Usually, Austin Case, my best friend and a diehard Lakers fan, is usually in the mix on this podcast, but he had some circumstances of why he couldn't be here. And normally, we would just not record when one of us is not available. But this was such a big night and a big win that I thought a solo pod was necessary, no matter what, because the Lakers delivered their best win of the year in a 117-102 fashion. I hope I do the win justice by myself. It will be probably a shorter pod. If anybody hops on live and asks a couple questions, I can answer them. But I would guess a pretty short pod, just kind of recap what I thought about the Lakers win in general and what it means moving forward. But again, it was just too important not to talk about. So that's why we are here. But yeah, easily the best win of the year. That's probably not saying much given what the Lakers have done this year. But it was definitely the most fun I've had watching Lakers basketball. It took until game 25 to have hope and fun while watching this team. But that's exactly what happened. Basically, start to finish. They didn't necessarily lead wire to wire, but it was a night where I didn't feel like the Celtics ever were going to win the game. The Lakers, from the jump, I mean, LeBron James set the tone in the first quarter. I think he had 15 of his 30 points in the first quarter alone or something around there. And while everyone else was kind of a bit slow to get it start, he really set the tone and made it go back and forth in the beginning. And then you saw AD and Russ kind of assert themselves into the game there in the second half. And that's kind of the identity I expect from this team. I mean, LeBron, I think I was pretty critical on the last podcast with Austin. I didn't like his shot selection lately. By the way, he's had 30-point games in 4 of the last 5 outings. I didn't necessarily know that. But I was pretty critical of LeBron and just kind of his shot selection as of late. But, you know, his shots were better early on. I think when he does it more in rhythm like he was tonight, those are the better shots rather than just kind of stare at the ball and pull up from the top of the key after a few seconds. And it doesn't necessarily always have to get to the rim. I just prefer maybe more of his in rhythm shots, which I think we saw tonight. And again, it really set the tone. AD, who got, you know, kind of some backlash and maybe slander on social media tonight before the game, and maybe rightfully so, did not have the best first half. He looked kind of like he was sleepwalking. He took only 4 shots in the first half. But then you saw him kind of put his handprint on the game on both ends of the floor, which honestly is not too dissimilar to what the Lakers did so well in the bubble, whereas AD wasn't always as engaged right from the start, but would eventually become one of the better players on the court. And maybe that's the recipe for success. And then obviously Russ had his moments, especially in the third quarter. He scored, what was it, 24 points, but, you know, especially to close out the third quarter, he was everywhere. He was aggressive as hell. And I was kind of reading the post-game quotes right before I jumped on this pod, but it sounds like, you know, LeBron and AD have been challenging him to do just that. He was kind of passive to start the year. But you can see maybe as he's becoming more comfortable, maybe he has a tendency to be more aggressive. And that's the version of Russ you like to see. I think as critical as I have been on this team since the start of the year, I have always been kind of rooting for this Russ experiment to work. I don't know if it will, but I think everyone has been so determined and so convinced that it's just going to fail that honestly I am rooting for it just because of that. I think, you know, when the move was made, you know, there was some rightful criticism on this podcast, but I argued ways that it could work. And I think maybe you saw a glimpse of that a little bit tonight, and just, you know, how he can get to the rim and this team can push it out in transition. So I don't know. It remains to be seen, you know, how it all fits together, but at least tonight was the first time I have optimism. And I guess that kind of brings me to the point just in general on this team. I mean, I feel like every time the Lakers have had a big win or a good win, I wouldn't say big win because they haven't really had too many of them. Anytime they've had a positive momentum, they haven't really carried that over. Just looking at their schedule, they were 8-8, they were 9-9, 10-10, 11-11, 12-12. So it's hard. They haven't been able to really string these moments together, right? And I think that's the next step here. This is as excited as I've ever been about this team this season, and it's mostly because it came against a good team like the Celtics. I mean, Celtics are a very solid team, and they played as well as they have on both ends of the floor. But I want to see them string this momentum together. And the schedule sets up that they can. Grizzlies on Thursday, Thunder on Friday. But if they can do this kind of, for a few games in a row, I think you can start to establish those good habits. On the last pod, which was after the Clippers loss, and honestly, that's about as, kind of sad, depressed about this team as I have been all year, where I thought it might not work. The concern was that, they were showing progress, but how much did it really matter, right? I was worried that while making small strides, you're not seeing the results, and then that could lead to a lot of finger pointing and blame going around. And eventually you get out of those kind of good habits and you fall into what's easy and what's comfortable. Part of what we loved about the championship team is they kind of set the tone on the defense end of the floor. They said, hey, we're going to be good on this end. Anthony Davis bought in. He forced LeBron to buy in. And then they went on a run to start the year that was incredible. And so all the role players and everyone else around them was like, yeah, this works. Let's set these good habits. And I think that carried over throughout the year. The Lakers haven't had any momentum like that this year, obviously. And so I think my concern was, even if you are showing progress, maybe you don't have the opportunity to have these moments like that where you get into kind of a rhythm like this and you get everyone else to sort of buy in. And I think you've seen, some of that, the downside of all that kind of bubbling. Obviously Frank Vogel's job security has been talked about pretty much for the last 10 games. LeBron has been questioned as if he is still one of the better players as the best player in the league. Pretty much for the last 2 months. Anthony Davis is being criticized, and and the whole Russell Westbrook experiment has been criticized since the very beginning. So I think if you didn't have good outcomes and good results, it could lead to bad habits, and that's been my concern all along. And so the hope here is that this is the quote unquote start, right? And that you can string some of these wins and positive outcomes together, and all of a sudden everyone starts to buy in. The Lakers have not been healthy to start the year, but now they're starting to get more healthy, and everyone can start to establish some of their roles. And again, that's a big ask based off one night of it, where the Lakers looked good, but it is the hope here. And I think that's my main takeaway from this game is that, there hasn't been too many games this year where I have left with a lot of optimism. Actually, most of our podcasts have been, criticizing the Lakers and finding their flaws and trying to fix them. Whereas tonight, I just had fun watching this team, and that hasn't happened this year. That happened very little last year, if at all. I remember off the top of my head that win against the Cavs where LeBron went off in overtime, but that wasn't anything special from a team aspect. Honestly, this may have been the most fun I've had watching this team since the bubble. It was fun. It's not like they were shooting lights out. It was starting on defense. They were doing a lot of, switching a lot of the non-AD action and letting him lurk in the lane and kind of protect the rim. On offense, felt like they were running sets. They did that ghost screen action with Wayne Ellington. And maybe you'll start to see more, plays of that nature, using Wayne Ellington as something other than the guy who just stands in the corner. Let him, let the defense gravitate to him by using him and moving him around. So I don't know. There was enough positive moments on both ends of the floor that I am optimistic for the first time. It's taken until game 25, but I feel like you can start to see some semblance of why they thought this team could work. Now, whether or not that does work remains to be seen. I think there's plenty of reasons why you could point to that it doesn't. But I'm choosing to be positive for this podcast because A, I'm by myself, and and B, because we just haven't been positive. This is actually probably a good podcast to not have Austin on, because he's a big Russ hater, and then Russ I thought was fantastic in this game. But yeah, it's just, I don't know. I mean, I live here in Vegas. Tempted to now, sprinkle some action on the Lakers winning the title. I mean, legit. I'm happy. I don't know. I guess I should reel it in a little bit. I don't know how likely it is that this is going to lead into anything, but I don't know. This is just the most fun I had watching the basketball team this year, and it was worthy of a podcast. So I hope you guys had as much fun as I did. That's probably going to do it. This is already too long of podcast for a solo person. It was a lot of me rambling. Moral of the story is the Lakers were awesome tonight, and that was fun as hell to watch. And it's always good to beat the Celtics. The Lakers are now 13-12 on the year after a 117-102 win over the Celtics. They'll play again on Thursday and play again on Friday. Grizzlies and Thunder back-to-back. We'll probably record sometime this weekend, and Austin will be back. And so you won't have to listen to me just ramble on and on. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast, the Lakers Theory podcast, that is. Make sure you're following us on all social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at Lakers Theory on all platforms. I am St. Jackson. This has been the Lakers Theory podcast, and thank you for listening.